Doomsday Clock is a comic written by Jeff Johns and illustrated by Gary Frank that came out between November 22nd, 2017 and December 18th, 2019. Which means by the time I release this video, Doomsday Clock may already be irrelevant. But that minor fact won't stop me. Since issue 6, I knew I wanted to at least try to make a video about this comic. I've never done anything like this. Basically,
I got a lot of problems with
DC Doomsday Clock.
now. You're gonna hear about it.
Originally, I planned on posing 3 questions to myself during this video, but I realized that it would make the video too long, so I now plan on making 3 videos covering 3 different questions. This video will cover the question of, did this story warrant the use of the Watchmen characters in Watchmen World? Question 2/video 2 will cover the topic of, was this comic topical for today's political and social environment? And finally, did I enjoy it? Which basically involves some miscellaneous points. So, did the story warrant the use of the Watchmen characters in the Watchmen world? Before I give my opinion and thoughts, I want to present some backstory to the use of the Watchmen property. The Watchmen characters, up until Doomsday Clock, have always been separate from the rest of the DC universe. There was a 25-year gap between Moore and Gibbons' original story and the Before Watchmen series. Now, the Before Watchmen series is in Watchmen continuity, I guess. Like the title implies, it takes place before the events of Watchmen. There wasn't any mixing with the outside DC universe. But Rorschach did meet Travis Bickle for whatever reason. Honestly, I don't care for the Before Watchmen stuff much. The series and the Zack Snyder movie that came out around the same time are probably guilty of many of the issues that I have with Doomsday Clock, but I really don't want to watch that movie again or take a harder look at the Before Watchmen stuff. They at least didn't match the Watchmen universe with the DC universe. But the movie and the series do seem to be DC dipping their toe into the Watchmen property, and my fear is they're about to jump right in. But why did it take so long for DC to start using the Watchmen property? The rumor is that Paul Levitz, a higher up in DC up until 2009, had an unspoken rule that there would be no new Watchmen stories, and there wasn't till Paul Levitz left, so there has to be some truth to this claim. So DC under Paul Levitz never commissioned a crossover or any new Watchmen content. Maybe out of some respect for the creators, or maybe they were scared of the backlash, or they just understood that the Watchmen characters were better suited staying where they were. DC Comics still continued to reprint Watchmen, thus retaining the rights and making money off the property. In fact, a collected edition like the Watchmen graphic novel was kind of rare to do at the time, so still a giant middle finger to Moore and Gibbons. It wasn't until Jeff Johns and others became higher-ups at DC that DC really began to taunt the angry wizard that is Alan Moore with an event such as Doomsday Clock. And an important aspect of this whole deal is the terms in which the original Watchmen comic was made. According to Moore and Gibbons, when they originally signed on to make Watchmen, the contract stated, when Watchmen is finished and DC have not used the characters for a year, they're ours. Moore and Gibbons made Watchmen under the false understanding that they'd be able to own the rights to the story and characters, which I find extremely sad because you hear about Todd McFarlane and the other Image guys, that when they were finally able to create and own their own characters, they went balls to the wall. They gave it everything they had. Todd McFarlane had created Spawn when he was like 16 or something, and had never introduced it into any of his Marvel work because the character was sacred to him, and he didn't want Marvel to own him. Now imagine if somehow with some evil corporate power, Marvel swooped in and took the rights of Spawn, Savage Dragon, and all the other Image characters. It'd be like if they stole Todd McFarlane's dream. Now, I don't think Moore and Gibbons had the same connection with the Watchmen characters that McFarlane had with Spawn. Everyone knows that they basically just made their own version of the Charlton characters, but they still put all they had into creating the story and world of Watchmen. You work a lot harder if you thought you were building your own house compared to someone else's. You get all the nicest material, you get the coolest secret rooms, whatever you wanted. Basically, DC legally took Moore and Gibbons' dream home. To be clear, the contract has never been made public, but to my knowledge, DC has never said that Moore and Gibbons were wrong. Moore and Gibbons do care about the characters, or at least what the characters represent and how they function in the story. Gibbons stated in the same panel from the before-mentioned Moore quote, "What would be horrendous, and DC could legally do it, would be to have Rorschach cross over with Batman or something like that. But I've got enough faith in them that I don't think that they'll do that. I think because of the unique team, they can't get anyone else to take over to do Watchmen 2, or anything else like that. And we've certainly got no plans to do Watchmen 2. So I find it strange that people who say that they are fans of the original work and original creators would basically do the exact opposite what the creators intended for these characters. So even if there wasn't some sleazy issue with using the Watchmen characters, I still don't dig it. I believe that the Watchmen characters are intrinsically tied to the Watchmen world and story, and the world to the characters. And as you start to pull on one, the other unravels, thus weakening both. One of the reasons the story and characters are so interconnected is the fact that the Watchmen characters aren't what you would call elastic characters. For a lack of a better term, they're concrete characters. They aren't like Superman, Batman, or even James Bond. These characters have been written by many different people during many different time periods. They've survived many different versions, while still being commonly accepted as the same character. Batman can be presented as a goofy swashbuckler or grim gothic guardian, or even whatever this is. But all these versions are still seen as Batman. They all had their parents killed before their eyes and now wear a bat costume to fight crime and have masked adventures. Hell, there could probably be a version of Batman where his parents weren't killed and he'd still be considered Batman. Even if some of these variations are disliked or downright despised, the general character of Batman will remain. Batman is Batman. He's an elastic character. The Watchmen characters, on the other hand, only exist in their world and time period. Really, they exist for their world and time period. Maybe in some alternate Earth to our own, Watchmen wasn't a miniseries, and just kept running and the characters became ageless like Superman and Batman, who constantly have their origin dates moved to coincide with the modern day. Personally, I'd find it strange if Dr. Manhattan reconstructed himself in August 2002 or some more modern time instead of November 1959, or if the comedian fought in the Afghanistan War instead of the Vietnam War. Thankfully, in the reality we live in, Watchmen was planned as a 12-issue comic. That's all. The original creators never planned on anything more. They designed the world and characters with the mindset that the story would have a beginning, middle, and end. True, there is history and preceding events of the original story. And I'm not talking about before Watchmen stuff. The under the hood and flashback stuff exists to better create the world of Watchmen, to give it a more lived-in feel, and the fact that Moore wanted to mess with time and tell a non-linear story. So once again, these aspects are there to create the story of Watchmen, not to set up sequels or prequels, etc. Back to the point on how modern versions of the Watchmen characters, like Afghanistan Comedian, I think would hurt the characters. The reason for that is because these characters are designed so that they represent certain abstract ideals. Like the Comedian can be seen as the chaos and senselessness of the Vietnam War. Rorschach is Ayn Rand's objectivism. Dr. Manhattan, among many things, represents nihilism or the nuclear hope of the 1960s. They thought they would have cars powered by nuclear energy by now. These characters at their core represent and deal with issues of their time. I read an interview with Grant Morrison where he complains that Moore didn't let the characters be smarter in the story, and he says it like a bad thing, but I really like how many of the characters are used as vehicles for bigger ideas, and how these ideas create the conflict of Watchmen. It does consequently shackle these characters to the story. And that's why I would also dare to say that Watchmen isn't really character-driven, or something along those lines. Like, is Fountainhead character-driven? Yes, it follows Howard Rourke and the plot is driven by his actions, but Howard Rourke is just a vessel for Ayn Rand's ideals of objectivism. Is that the same as a movie like Uncut Gems, where another guy named Howard's actions drive the plot? But I'm pretty sure this Howard is just an exaggerated version of someone the directors knew, and not a standard for an ideology. Or does that really affect the definition of character-driven? Beats me, I didn't go to film school. Even some more elastic characters have some characteristics that must stay intact for the character to stay intact. During the comic Marvel Civil War, Spider-Man says, while talking about Steve Rogers and the Punisher, "Are you kidding me, man? Cap's probably the reason he," referring to the Punisher, "went to Vietnam. Same guy, different war." And it would be a completely different story if Captain America had originally fought in Vietnam. So just like how Captain America is best represented by the guy who fought in World War II and then comes out of the ice about 5 years ago, the Watchmen characters are best represented by staying in their world. Another issue besides the elasticating of the Watchmen characters is the elasticating of their world and story, and by that I mean hurting it. The original Watchmen story isn't a normal superhero story. Many would say that it's not even a superhero story, it's satire and all that. And a lot of other people have explored that aspect of it. But the aspect I want to touch on is its sci-fi-ness or comic bookiness. Alan Moore and probably others have said that what makes good sci-fi is you introduce one unbelievable factor into the real world, and play everything like how the real world would react to it. For Watchmen, that unbelievable factor is Dr. Manhattan. Now, there are some others, like the presence of real-life costume crime fighters, which we do actually have in America and other parts of the world, but they've never been that culturally impactful, and I'm pretty sure there was none in the 1950s. A cool side effect of the prevalence of the costume heroes in the Watchmen world is the fact that they aren't seen as fantasy anymore. Superhero stories aren't as exciting because of that. Why read Batman comics when I can watch Night Owl's latest exports on the news? Instead of comics being focused on superheroes, they instead focus on pirates and presumably other fantasy adventures, which, side note, I've always found pretty interesting because before the Marvel movies got really big, the Pirates of the Caribbean was the biggest movie franchise. I guess pirates, superheroes, wizards, and cowboys roughly all fit the same place in the public zeitgeist. And Dr. Manhattan has a lot of impact on this world, with the general advancement of technology such as electric cars. Nixon is still president thanks to Dr. Manhattan winning the Vietnam War for the USA, which I have always viewed as how many superheroes just defend the status quo, thus represented by, with superheroes, the people in power more easily are able to stay in power. But with the DC universe, there are thousands of unbelievable factors. There's space wizards, there are robots that can control the weather, and there's more micro, alternate, upside-down, sideways universes than you can count. The DC universe has everything, and that's why I love it. But because of this, it's also harder to examine how one of these factors would impact the world at large. While examining the idea of how cultures and governments would react to Superman, the world also gets slammed with the ramifications of the existence of the Amazons, Atlanteans, and psychic gorillas. And then there's an invasion of the evil versions of the Justice League. So it's a lot easier just to say that everything is pretty much the same. Patrick H. Wilms has a really cool video on this. Like, how the hell would George Washington or any other real-life president still be elected in the DC universe? What's Obama's Superman policy? Would the Republican Party really have such a problem with Mexicans entering the country if we had just been invaded by real-life outer space aliens? And so this is why I love Watchmen. It has the room to explore the impacts of these factors. Now, DC Comics does sometimes explore the impacts of their unbelievable factors. It's not impossible. But any introspection or realization of a hard new status quo due to these thought-out effects could be undone by the next writer or next event. I don't think it's worth unraveling the integrity of Watchmen just so the DC Universe can have another mopey god character. Jeff Johns says that he felt that he needed to use the Watchmen characters, that they were the only way to tell the story that he wanted to tell. I find this to be bullshit. The Watchmen characters are pretty well-established archetypes. That's how Moore designed them. And as previously stated, they're based off the Charlton characters. So why not just use them? Or there's Grant Morrison's Earth 4 characters, which is basically just his version of the Watchmen characters. Or you could get any other nihilist god character that DC has the right to. Or you could have just made his own characters. And the added benefit of making your own characters is you're creating something new with no constraints. You can create a world that functions differently than any other comic book world. It could present interactions that have never been shown before. That's what Watchmen did. I don't think the story would have been half as good if Moore had used the original Charlton characters. But of course, new characters don't sell as well as well-known characters. At least not initially. The point is, none of the Watchmen characters are super unique on base level. I don't know if there's any truly unique characters in fiction. There are unique journeys that characters take, but especially in comics, most characters come from a good, well-known group of archetypes. I don't think John picked the Watchmen characters because they're unique and they're the only characters that could have been used to tell the story. It seems to me, at least, he just wanted to smash some action figures together. And I'll get back to the action figure analogy in a minute, but at the moment I just want to touch on what if the Watchmen characters were indeed super unique characters. I assume this would mean they are some of the few comic book characters that exist and function in a political world. I'm deriving this from the fact that Jeff Johns said that he felt that he needed to write this comic because of the 2016 election. There are moments in Watchmen where the characters' political leanings are plainly expressed, which is semi-unique, especially at this moment for mainstream comics. But there are definitely characters in the DC universe that have political leanings and would have an opinion on the Trump administration and the atmosphere surrounding it. And you don't even have to talk about Trump. But what about white nationalism or immigration, etc.? You're telling me Green Arrow, that liberal cuck, doesn't have any opinion on any of this? Or that his actions would somehow go against the growing wage gap between the wealthy elite and the poor? Or the fear-mongering that villainizes disadvantaged groups? But instead, the only use of Green Arrow in this comic is him talking about Superman's piss or something? Or how about the fact in real life, in the USA today, there's a conspiracy theory group that thinks the government is controlled by a cabal of Satanist pedophiles whose champion's name is Q. Come on, your goal is to make a topical comic and you're not going to do anything with that? Dope. I will go more into the topicalness of Doomsday Clock in the next video. The other aspect that I assume Jeff sees the need for the Watchmen characters is the philosophical conflict between Dr. Manhattan's nihilism and Superman's optimism, which again, he could have just used another character. And I do have some thoughts about the execution of that conflict, which I will also touch on in the next video. Okay, back to the action figure analogy, which is something Jeff said that he was definitely trying not to do.
I think there's a real slippery slope of just saying, oh, let's have Rorschach and Batman have a fist fight. We're not interested in just kind of having some funny mashup, because that's not what we're doing.
John states a good amount of times that his intentions were not for this just to be a Dr. Manhattan and Superman fist fight.
And I have no interest in drawing, Superman punching Dr. Manhattan.
Which, granted, doesn't happen. Superman and Dr. Manhattan never physically fight. But Dr. Manhattan straight up fights almost everyone else in the DC universe. Issue 9 is probably one of my least favorite issues in the book. Dr. Manhattan destroys almost every superhero in the DC universe minus the Trinity. Hell, even the Doom Patrol's invited to this beatdown. The Doom Patrol is my favorite superhero team, but it makes almost no sense that they would accompany the Justice League and others to Mars. Like, who the hell even called them? They're the misfits of the superhero community. It only makes sense to me if you also know that there's a Doom Patrol TV show airing right now that Johns is also a producer of. In fact, why do any of these clowns show up? Yeah, a bit of Russia got blown up or something, but that's not even remotely the worst thing to happen in DC Comics in the last year or so. And usually only the Justice League shows up. But this time they send everyone in DC proper before they even check it out. Like, who the hell even is this guy? Please tell me if you know. But what inner logic is that? What if no one was even on Mars? Like, it turned out it was just a receptor giving off the radiation that they were tracking. What a bunch of dumbbells they would have looked like. 100 superheroes fly all the way to Mars just to go back to Earth. This dumb jump in logic only serves the empty purpose of the equivalent of a child smashing his action figures together, which, don't get me wrong, is pretty cool, but isn't much in the way of substance. And I hope I don't say this too much in the video, but being cool wasn't really the vibe of Watchmen. Another thing, this ties into the issue of the characters of Watchmen being changed by entering the DC universe. The original John Osterman was the only superpowered being in his world. He was the only one who could possibly save the world single-handedly. But he didn't. He's disenfranchised by the human race. But now he's just one super guy in a sea of many superpowered beings. The burden of responsibility doesn't fall on him anymore. There are actual gods in the DC universe and other time travels, and beings as old as eternity. Dr. Manhattan isn't special anymore, or alone anymore. This takes away one of the core aspects of Dr. Manhattan. In the original Watchmen comic, all his struggles were emotional or philosophical. He was beyond physical conflict. The use of the comedian is pretty solid evidence that a lot of this book is just smashing action figures together. Jeff Johns had to bring him back to life, which doesn't even seem like a thing that could happen for the Watchmen characters, minus Dr. Manhattan. He shows up in Doomsday Clock because Dr. Manhattan pulls him out of his universe into the DC universe right before he's about to die. Why the f*** would Dr. Manhattan do that? Comedian mentions that Manhattan just wanted him to kill Ozymandias' cat. That's the best explanation Jeff Johns cared to give. The near god that is Dr. Manhattan pulls a dying man past his prime from another reality just to kill a f***ing cat? What a waste of a character. The first thing Comedian does in Doomsday Clock is he attacks Lex Luthor and Ozymandias. Oh, see, it's cool. This time the Comedian surprises Ozymandias and almost throws him out of a window. It's an Ozymandias and Comedian rematch. Woohoo! The Comedian also shoots Lex Luthor. He later shoots a bunch of DC villains. Not really sure why. I guess it's just cool to see him kill D-list villains. He is then captured by the Mind People and does nothing else for the rest of the book, until Lex Luthor zaps him back to his world right before he dies. There was no point in him being in this book. He could have been replaced with anyone with a gun. Lex Luthor doesn't know who he is. None of the villains that he shoots knows who he is. He's only arguably meaningful for us, the audience, and the other Watchmen characters. But screw those guys. The Comedian doesn't represent anything this time. He isn't used to present any ideas or anything. He could have been a vessel to explore police brutality. That seems up his alley. That was topical in 2016, especially now. To be fair, comics don't always have to have a deeper meaning or be complex. Most of them aren't, and I'm totally fine with that. But the original Watchmen didn't just have things happen because they were cool. And this is supposed to be the sequel to Watchmen. It's supposed to carry on the quality and the themes of the original. It'd be kind of weird if the second Godfather movie was a, Michael Bay-esque blockbuster movie, but it just has Italian gangsters. Therefore, it's the same as the original Godfather. Not only is the use of the Comedian pointless, but it also hurts the original story. I know the next time I flip through Watchmen or I'm telling somebody about Eddie Blake, I'll go, well, you see, he gets thrown out of a window and he dies, and that's what really starts the story. But according to Jeff Johns, while he's falling down, he's transported to the DC universe, screws around a bit, fails to kill a cat, and then he gets sent right back before he dies. And maybe the person I'm talking to would go, that seems kind of dumb. And I'll say, yeah, it is. This is a blaring example of how using the Watchmen characters will damage the original story. I'm just concerned this is the beginning of the stretching of the Watchmen property, and I'm pretty sure it will kill it. Or at least it will definitely kill Alan Moore. I'm not sure how many ways I can say it. It's like mashing all your food together. It blends everything together, therefore dulling all the individual tastes. A lot of times after small publishers are acquired by DC Comics, the characters from those universes see less and less use. And now they have to function in the DC universe, which may be very different from the world they came from. When was the last time you saw Hardwire in a story? Or why use Apollo when you can use Superman? And I'm pretty sure I'd break my computer if I ever saw that Jesse Custard was going to team up with Superman, or whatever dumb, creatively bankrupt idea DC's going to pump out in the future. And the dilution of Watchmen into mediocrity already seems to be happening. Tom King may be writing a new Watchmen-related book or something. Dr. Manhattan has something to do with a new DC dark metal story. But honestly, Moore probably doesn't care anymore. And why should I guess? It's just there are a lot of bad comics out there, and I'd rather see good comics made than mediocre ones. And it especially sucks when good properties are watered down to fit into the vast majority of mediocrity. Once DC is done squeezing out everything special from Watchmen, we will probably be left with something like this.
Strong together, united forever, they're the best of friends. But when trouble's about, you'd best watch out for the Watchmen.
Well, that kind of ended on a sad note. But if you watched the whole video, thank you. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I would really like to hear what you thought about it. About the editing, the sound quality, Doomsday Clock in general, anything. And I hope you have a good one.